Okay, so strap yourselves in. We are diving deep into the impeachment of South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol.
Yeah, it's like a political thriller, you know?
It really is. We've got a whole stack of articles here.
And it's crazy. This wasn't even the first try to get him out.
Right, the first impeachment attempt.
Back on December 7th.
Which fizzled out because Yoon's own party boycotted it.
The People Power Party.
People Power Party.
The main center-right party over there.
Right, for those keeping score at home.
Exactly.
So to see this second attempt so soon after...
And for it to succeed.
Well, it's pretty remarkable.
It is what happened in those few days.
Yeah, what shifted the landscape?
Well, before we get to that, we need to remember that Yoon was already not doing great.
Already on shaky ground.
Yeah, his approval ratings were tanking even before this martial law thing happened.
Right.
And then on December 3rd, boom, he drops this bombshell. He declares martial law.
Whoa, hold on, martial law.
Yeah.
Not something you hear every day, especially in a democratic country like South Korea.
Exactly. It sent shockwaves through the country. And you got to remember, this was the first time martial law had been declared since South Korea transitioned from a military dictatorship to a democracy back in the late 1980s.
So like a ghost from the past.
For a lot of South Koreans, it was exactly that.
So what was Yoon's justification for this?
He said he needed to quell anti-state forces.
Anti-state forces.
Yeah, and protect the constitutional order. But, you know, reading between the lines, it seems like his real target was the opposition Democratic Party.
He was accusing them of trying to overthrow the government.
Pretty much.
That's a heavy accusation. Do you think there's any truth to that?
It's a question that's still being debated fiercely, you know?
Right.
But what we know for sure is that it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah.
The public was outraged. Immediate, intense protests all over the country.
Okay, so we've got a president declaring martial law facing tanking popularity, and now these protests, things are escalating pretty quickly. What happens next?
Well, the martial law thing itself is actually pretty short-lived. Yoon had to withdraw it after just 6 hours.
6 hours?
Yeah, because there was overwhelming opposition from the parliament.
Wow.
But those 6 hours, you know, it unleashed a chain of events he couldn't control.
I imagine the protests you mentioned played a big role in that. What were they like?
From what we've seen, it was a mix of anger defiance, but also, interestingly, a sense of hope, even celebration.
Really?
Yeah, the New York Times had this great article. They were describing how protesters were weaving light sticks.
Light sticks?
Yeah, the kind you see at K-pop concerts, which apparently reflects this shift in protest culture in South Korea towards being more vibrant, joyful.
So it's not just about anger, it's about feeling empowered to express their democratic rights.
Absolutely. And, you know, it wasn't just the protests. There were also investigations launched into Yoon's inner circle.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his defense minister and police chief, they were arrested. A travel ban slapped on them. Things were unraveling fast.
It sounds like that martial law declaration really blew up in his face.
Mm-hmm.
Did he underestimate the public reaction?
It seems that way. And then there were these weird little details that came out.
Like what?
Like this report in the South China Morning Post about Yoon allegedly using decoy convoys to make it look like he was getting to work on time.
Decoy convoys?
Yeah.
What was that about?
Apparently there were all these rumors going around that he was often late because of, shall we say, a fondness for late-night celebrations.
Okay.
So using decoy convoys, it was a way to try and control the narrative of this project, this image of being on top of things.
But in the middle of a crisis like this, it just makes you look out of touch, a little desperate maybe?
Exactly. And it all fed into this sense that he was losing control both of the situation and of his own image.
Right.
And so with all of this going on, the opposition parties, they decide to try again with another impeachment vote.
Sensing an opportunity with all the public pressure mounting.
Totally. And remember, the first attempt failed because Yoon's party boycotted it.
Yeah.
But this time they decided to participate in the vote, which was a huge turning point.
So even within his own party, the support was crumbling.
That's right. The final vote was 204 to 85, way more than the two-thirds majority they needed.
Wow.
The National Assembly Speaker, Woo Won-shik, he put it perfectly. He called the impeachment an outcome driven by the people's ardent desire for democracy, courage, and dedication.
It sounds like a real turning point for South Korea. So what happens next? Yoon immediately removed.
Not exactly. The impeachment vote basically suspends his presidential powers,
Okay.
but the final decision rests with the Constitutional Court.
So the court has to decide whether to permanently kick him out or give him back the job.
Yep, a lot of power in their hands.
Yeah, this is getting really interesting. We've got a suspended president, a court deciding his fate, and a nation on edge.
A real cliffhanger.
I can't wait to dive deeper into this. Welcome back. We're picking up our deep dive with South Korea still in this state of political limbo.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly this unfolded? 1 minute, you've got a president seemingly in control.
And the next, he's fighting to keep his job.
It's a reminder of how fast things can change, especially in politics.
Right. And speaking of rapid changes, let's go back to that martial law declaration for a second.
Oh, yeah.
It was like a bomb went off both domestically and internationally.
It really was.
You mentioned it caused quite a stir outside of South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
What were the global implications of this?
Well, for one, it definitely got people's attention in Washington.
Okay.
The U.S. and South Korea, they've got this long-standing alliance, right? And stability in South Korea is really important for U.S. interests in the region.
Makes sense, especially with the constant tension with North Korea.
Exactly. The U.S. wouldn't want to see their ally destabilized, and there were even some reports in the Korean media that U.S. officials were reaching out to opposition figures in South Korea.
Really?
Yeah, expressing concerns about Yoon's actions, and maybe even trying to subtly influence the wording of the impeachment motion.
Wow, so the U.S. was actively involved behind the scenes.
Yeah.
What were they so worried about?
They seemed particularly concerned about any language that criticized Yoon's foreign policy, specifically his efforts to build stronger ties with Japan.
Okay.
The Biden administration sees that as a key strategic goal for the region, so they wouldn't want to see it undermined.
So it's like a ripple effect. A domestic crisis in South Korea can end up having these international consequences, impacting alliances and partnerships.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected global politics is. What happens in one country can have these far-reaching implications.
Okay, let's shift back to the domestic situation for a minute. You mentioned earlier that even some members of Yoon's own party were caught off guard by his martial law declaration. What does that tell us about what was going on politically in South Korea at the time?
What suggests that there were already some cracks forming within the ruling party. Maybe Yoon was more isolated than people realized.
So perhaps some in his own party were already having doubts about his leadership.
Yeah, even before this whole incident.
And those doubts probably intensified after the martial law declaration and everything that followed.
Absolutely. The impeachment vote really exposed those divisions within the People Power Party.
Sure.
Remember, some of their members actually voted in favor of impeachment.
Right.
Even though the party's official stance was against it.
So even his own allies were turning against him. It seems like a classic case of overreach leading to a loss of support.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it also speaks to the importance of consensus building in a democracy.
Yeah.
You know, Yoon seemed to be operating in a very top-down manner, which ultimately backfired.
And this whole situation also really highlights the power of public pressure in a democracy. Those protests we talked about earlier, they clearly played a role in pushing things forward.
Oh, absolutely. The protests were a crucial factor. They showed just how angry and dissatisfied the public was with Yoon's actions. It's a powerful reminder that even in a system where power is concentrated in the hands of one person, the people can still make their voices heard.
It's almost like a pressure cooker situation, right? Public discontent builds up over time, and then an event like this martial law declaration becomes the tipping point. It releases all that pent-up frustration.
That's a great analogy, and it's important to remember that those protests weren't just about anger. You know, they were also about hope. People were expressing their desire for a more democratic, more accountable government.
So this wasn't just a story about a president's downfall. It was also about a society grappling with its democratic values and pushing for greater transparency.
Exactly, and it's something we're seeing in other parts of the world, too. People are demanding more from their leaders, and they're willing to take to the streets to make those demands heard.
It's a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation from citizens.
Absolutely. Now, with all this turmoil going on, Yoon finds himself suspended his fate in the hands of the Constitutional Court.
So this group of judges, they hold the future of the presidency in their hands. What kind of deliberations do they go through? What factors are they considering when making this decision?
Well, they have 180 days to reach a verdict, so they'll be examining all the evidence, listening to arguments from both sides, and weighing the legal and constitutional implications of Yoon's actions.
So it's like a trial, but for the president himself, what are some of the key arguments that each side will be making?
Well, Yoon's lawyers will probably argue that the martial law declaration, while maybe not the best move, wasn't actually illegal.
Okay.
And that he was acting within his constitutional powers as president to protect national security. They'll probably try to downplay the significance of the protests, too, framing them as the actions of just a small vocal minority.
And what about the arguments against Yoon?
They'll likely focus on the overreach of executive power that the martial law declaration represents. They'll argue that it was a totally disproportionate response to the situation and that it created this climate of fear and intimidation. They'll also point to the public outcry as evidence that Yoon's actions were widely condemned.
So it boils down to a battle over the interpretation of the Constitution and the limits of presidential power.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be interesting to see how the court balances those competing perspectives.
And there's another layer of complexity to this whole thing, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a big one.
What's that?
The Constitutional Court is actually short-staffed right now.
Really?
Yeah, 3 of the 9 judge positions are vacant.
Wait, so they're making this huge decision with a partially filled court? How is that even possible?
Well, it reflects the political gridlock that's been gripping South Korea for a while now. Those vacancies haven't been filled because of partisan bickering in the parliament. So the court is basically operating with a reduced bench, which could definitely impact the final decision.
That's incredible. So not only are they dealing with this high-stakes case, but they're doing it with a limited number of judges that adds a whole new level of pressure and scrutiny.
Absolutely, and it raises questions about the court's legitimacy and whether their decision will be seen as politically motivated no matter what they decide.
This is also fascinating. We've gone from a seemingly stable democracy to a country on the verge of a constitutional crisis, all in a matter of weeks.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that even well-established democracies aren't immune to instability and that the balance of power can shift in unexpected ways.
It leaves us with so many questions. What will the court decide? How will South Korea move forward from this? What are the long-term implications for the country's political system?
Those are all questions we'll be tackling in the final part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned because this story is far from over. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into President Yoon's impeachment. And man, the suspense is building.
It really is like waiting for a verdict.
Right, a courtroom drama, except the stakes are way higher.
Yeah, the court's decision, it's not just about Yoon's fate. It's about the future of South Korean politics.
So let's talk scenarios. What happens if the court upholds the impeachment? What does that mean for South Korea?
Well, if they decide to remove Yoon permanently, then South Korea is going to have a snap presidential election within 60 days.
Wow, 60 days.
Yeah, mad dash political parties scrambling to find the right candidate.
Trying to capture the public mood?
Exactly. I bet the opposition parties are already strategizing, seeing this as their chance to grab power.
Right, they probably campaign on a platform of stability, democratic renewal, contrasting themselves with Yoon.
Right.
Painting him as this authoritarian figure.
Yeah, promising a return to normalcy, responsible governance.
But wouldn't that risk further dividing the country? What about Yoon's supporters? Would they just quietly accept the court's decision?
That's a good question. Remember, there were those counter-protests in support of Yoon, arguing that the impeachment was all political.
Yeah, a witch hunt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if the court sides against him, it can make things even worse, lead to more instability.
So even if removing Yoon is seen as necessary to protect democracy, it's not a simple solution.
Nope. It's a really complex situation, and it raises an interesting question for our listeners.
Yeah.
How do you balance the need for accountability with the potential for instability?
Right. Is it worth risking political turmoil to remove a leader who, in the eyes of many, violated democratic norms?
It's a tough one.
Okay, so let's flip the script. What if the court overturns the impeachment? Yoon gets his job back, but is that really a victory?
That's where it gets really tricky. Even if he's reinstated, his authority would be so weakened. Can you imagine trying to govern when a big chunk of the population thinks you abused your power, tried to subvert democracy?
He'd be a lame duck president, constantly fighting opposition, struggling to get anything done.
Exactly. He might be able to cling to power, but his ability to actually lead would be shot. And all the problems that led to this crisis, the economic anxieties, the social divisions, the worries about North Korea.
They don't just disappear.
Nope.
So it seems like South Korea's in for a rough ride no matter what the court decides.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that democracy is fragile, even in a country with a pretty solid track record.
And it highlights the importance of staying vigilant citizens, being engaged, holding their leaders accountable, institutions functioning as checks on power.
It really does. And, this isn't just a South Korean problem. We're seeing similar things happening in other democracies around the world.
Right, rising polarization, declining trust in institutions, leaders pushing the limits of their authority.
It's a global trend, and what's happening in South Korea It's like a microcosm of that. It's a wake-up call for all of us to think critically about the state of our own democracies.
So what can we do as individuals? It can feel so overwhelming to think about tackling these big systemic issues.
You're right, it can, but I think it starts with staying informed, engaging in thoughtful discussions like the one we're having right now, and holding our own leaders accountable no matter where we live.
It's about recognizing that democracy is not a spectator sport. We all have to participate.
Absolutely. And it's about understanding that democracy is a journey, not a destination. There will always be challenges, setbacks, uncertainties.
But as long as we're willing to engage, to debate, to hold each other accountable, we can keep moving forward.
Well said.
This has been an incredible deep dive. So many twists and turns. We've explored the complexities of South Korean politics, the fragility of democracy and the power of the people.
It's a story that's still being written.
And we'll be watching closely to see what happens next. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol.
It's been a fascinating journey.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.